Hey, today I have a new paint sprayer to share with you. It's the Wagner FLEXiO 3000. I can't wait to show you how it worked on this nightstand makeover and share my thoughts on it. Alright, these are the nightstands I'm working with. I scored them both from a trip to the thrift store. They're about the same size and height, but are completely different styles. In my experience, single nightstands don't sell well, so I usually skip over single nightstands. But a pair of nightstands sells really well, especially if they're taller than 24 inches. So my goal is to make them into a mismatch set. Before we dive in, a quick note, all of the products that I use in this video will be linked in the description. To get started, I did what I always do to prep for paint. I removed the hardware and then I filled in the hardware holes on the French provincial nightstand so I could replace the pole with a knob. The other nightstand just had knobs, so I left the holes alone over there. While I waited for that to dry, I worked on a few other things. I removed the backsplash from the colonial style nightstand. It was only attached with 3 screws on the back, so it only took a minute to get it off. I wasn't a fan of it. It just made the nightstand look even taller and even more different than the French nightstand. Let's just say that I was glad to see it go. Then I cleaned off the dust and the grime that was on the nightstands with some crud cutter. They were a little bit extra dirty, so I ended up wiping them down twice with crud cutter, and then I used a clean wet rag to wipe them off one more time. And then I dove into scuff sanding. I used my handy dandy little surf prep sander and medium grit foam sponge to help me sand all the curves, spindles, and details without messing them up. It's attached to my shop vac, so most of the dust gets sucked up instead of going into the air. The French nightstand has a laminate top, so I made extra sure to give it extra good sanding to help the paint stick. And then for the rest, I at least sanded enough just to scuff up the old finish to help the paint stick. But mostly I took the time to sand and smooth out everywhere where the paint had chipped off or had been damaged. It also gave me a chance to look over each piece really well, and I realized that there was this crack on the one side that needed filled in with a little bit of wood filler. So I filled it in and let it dry. By the time it was dry, the quick wood in the hardware holes was dry, so I sanded both of those areas down flush with the surface of the wood. I also took the time to sand the inside of the French Provincial's drawer. It had a few stains and marks, but they were pretty easy to sand out with 100 grit sandpaper. And then before I moved on, I primed everything with clear shellac. The next day, I busted into my new toy, this Wagner FLEXiO 3000 that Wagner sent me. I've seen a few other furniture painters use the sprayer, so I've really wanted to test it out and see how it works and see how it compares to my other sprayers. This one comes with 2 front end nozzles and 1 turbine. The bigger one is the eye spray nozzle. It's made for walls, fences, siding, basically things that are okay to have a painted texture on them. So I'm not going to use this one for furniture. The other nozzle is the detail finish nozzle. It's made for fine finishes on furniture, cabinets, and trim, so I'll be using this smaller one to paint furniture. I mixed up a 1-to-1 ratio of 2 of my favorite colors for this project, this deep blue called Peacoat and this stunning emerald green called Fireworks. On their own, they're gorgeous colors. Mixed together though, I think I love them even more. I poured them each into a measuring cup so I could more easily figure out the water to paint ratio that I needed to thin out the paint with. And then I mixed the 2 colors together really well. And then it was time to thin the paint. I was a little bit nervous about this part, I'm not gonna lie, but I started out by thinning it out by 10% because that's the measurement I hear about a lot. I had 2 cups of paint measured out, so I grabbed my calculator and I figured out that 2 cups times 10% was 0.2 of a cup, which is pretty close to 1/4 of a cup. So I put a little bit less than 1/4 of a cup of water into the paint. And then I mixed that up really well. But from my experience of spraying with my other Wagner paint sprayer, I felt like it was still a little bit too thick. I had read on Wagner's website somewhere in a Q&A that really thick paints might need to be thinned out by 20% instead of just 10%. And this Country Chic paint is some pretty thick paint. I also know that this paint can handle being thinned out a lot more than other types of paint can. So I decided to add another almost 1/4 cup of water to the mix to thin it out by a total of 20%. After the water was completely mixed into the paint, I thought that the paint consistency looked a lot like it had when I've used the viscosity cup that was included with my other Wagner paint sprayer, so I decided that I was good to go and I wanted to give it a try. I poured it in the sprayer using a mesh filter to make sure that there weren't any clumps or debris in the paint that would clog the paint sprayer. So included with this sprayer was this poster that you can spray on to test out the sprayer and to practice getting used to it. So I taped it up to my wall and tested it out. I set the power setting on the top of the sprayer to 5, made sure that the spray pattern was set to spray horizontally, and twisted the material flow knob so less paint came out. And then I plugged in the paint sprayer. I pointed the sprayer at the poster and pulled the trigger back just a little bit to get the turbine going. Then I pulled it all the way back and sprayed across the poster. I adjusted the material flow and power settings a few times, and I was pretty happy with the thickness of the paint and how it was spraying a really fine mist. So I moved on to spraying the nightstands. After the first pass though, I realized that it was coming out way too much for my comfort, so I messed around with the settings some more, and then I realized that I was turning the material flow knob in the wrong direction. So I unscrewed it a lot more. And then I slowly screwed it back in just a little bit at a time, testing it after a few twists to see if the paint was coming out enough. And after a few more twists, I got it to the setting that I liked and I felt comfortable with. It was somewhere in the middle, not too much and not too little. If too much paint is coming out, then you get more of the overspray in the air, which just wastes paint. But too much paint can also cause the paint to drip or sag or puddle on the furniture, and then you have to fix it and it's just a pain. So I try to err on the side of less paint coming out. I don't usually put my furniture upside down, but since these were only a few inches off the ground, and since one nightstand had spindles, I thought it was best to just flip them over so I could get a good coat on the bottom side. So let's talk a second about thinning the paint. Yeah, the detail finish nozzle does require that the paint be thinned out a bit, especially if you're using chalk paint or a thick paint. Honestly though, it's not surprising to me one little bit. I have a professional grade, expensive paint sprayer, and I still thin my paint out with that bad boy, even though it can spray really thick chalk paint just fine. Thinning out the paint gives it the ability to atomize and create a really nice fine finish. Basically a finish that doesn't have a bunch of texture or splatters in it. So even if this paint sprayer didn't require the paint to be thinned with a detail finish nozzle, I still would thin the paint at least a small amount. This paint sprayer doesn't come with a viscosity cup like my other Wagner paint sprayer does, so I was a little bit worried about getting the paint just right for the sprayer. It ended up being so easy though to measure out how much paint I was putting in the sprayer and then multiply that by 10 or 20% to see how much water I needed to add. Here's what they looked like after just one coat of paint. You could still see a little bit of the old finish, but most of it was covered with a thin coat of paint. So I gave it all a second coat of paint and let it dry before I flipped them over to give them a coat on the right side. After the first coat was dry on the right side, I could see outlines of the places where the old paint had chipped in the details on the top. So I grabbed some 220 grit sandpaper and smoothed those areas out better than I had before. Sometimes you just don't see the imperfections until you get some paint on it. Then I cleaned up all of the dust that I had created and sprayed another coat of paint on. And then I cleaned out my paint sprayer and started mixing up the poly for my top coat. First, I stirred and stirred and stirred and stirred the poly some more. And then I stirred it some more. Over the years, I've learned that stirring poly is so stinking important, especially over dark colors. The properties that make the sheen more matte in the poly are foggy white, and they like to settle to the bottom of the can. So if you don't mix the poly really well, they don't get evenly dispersed into the poly. And then the sprayer will spray pockets of them onto your paint, resulting in foggy looking areas and shiny looking areas. That's also why I like to buy poly in quart cans instead of gallon-sized cans. It's so much easier to make sure it's all stirred really well with a quart size than a gallon size. Of course, I poured it through my mesh filter to make sure there wasn't any debris in the poly that would clog my sprayer. I personally like to thin the water-based poly just a little bit. Thinning it out makes it take just a little bit longer to dry, which makes it also dry smoother. But with poly, it can be sprayed without thinning. So I don't really measure how much water I add into the poly. I just add a little bit. And then I added a little bit of paint into my poly. This is a trick that I was reminded about from Katie at Salvaged by Kay Scott. She does such an amazing job and is so inspiring, so go check out her YouTube channel. Top coating dark paint colors can be really tricky, but adding some paint into the poly makes the poly top coat so much easier to spray. It looks a lot better and hides a little bit of that foggy and streaking you might have. So after I stirred the poly up, added some water and paint to it, and stirred it really well again, I was ready to spray it. Once again, I sprayed it on the practice poster, and man, am I glad that I did. I would have had a huge drip on my nightstands. I sprayed that first coat of poly and let it dry completely for an hour. And then I grabbed a very fine Surf Prep foam pad and sanded everything down. This was just to smooth the finish out so it felt really nice and soft. Then I cleaned all of the dust off with my shop vac and tack cloth. And then I sprayed 3 more coats of poly, including one where the nightstands were upside down again. Before I share what they look like now, please take a second to hit the like and subscribe buttons. It really helps us out, so thank you so much. So here's what they looked like before. And here's what they look like now. I am in love with this deep teal blue. And honestly, I was pretty happy with this paint sprayer. It sprayed the thinned out chalk paint like a champ. I love the 2-stage trigger and how it helps prevent the splattering when the turbine starts, and I love the feeling of some extra control with being able to change the power setting on top of the turbine. Oh, and I love that it has a case too. And cleanup really does only take 5 to 10 minutes. I actually think that it is really similar to my Wagner sprayer, the Control Spray Double Duty Paint Sprayer. I started out using the double duty paint sprayer, and I think both of these are a really great beginner or entry level paint sprayer for painting furniture. Anyway, what do you think about the mismatched nightstands?